A question for Donna, just because I know a little bit about this local context, Australia. Can you please discuss the impact of the equal remuneration case that raised the wages of social and community service workers in Australia? I think it's still being rolled out, or is it? I'm not sure. Perhaps it's already rolled out.
It's John Peters, Laurentian University. I thought all the presentations were great, right? It sort of pose all kinds of big questions, especially about how do you cope with low-wage work? Who's going to cope with low-wage work? How do we try and get around low-wage work? How do we push back? Where can we push back? I think those are all sort of really, really good questions. And I think doing comparative work like you're doing, Jill, I think is fantastic because it actually shows, look, there are bars. We don't have to look for the best practice to make things worse. We can look at the best practice to make things better for everyone. I guess my question would be is who's going to push this? And where should we push this? Is this, maybe you can think of the EU, that maybe ETUI, there's some, Labour MEPs that might push it at the European Parliament, but who else is going to be able to push it? Where could we push it? I guess that'd be one thing. For the Irish case, I think for my question that immediately comes to mind is, well, where to push, right? Is there any, so you have what looks like a very nice policy, but so it seems like it's just completely amorphous, like it's in terms of the legislative nature of it. Is there a low-wage area or a low-wage commission? I think there is, if I recall. Yeah. That you could push that to at least raise wages? Is that something that might be? Are there other kinds of enforcement agencies, or is it like the UK where it's split across 4 or 5? Or is it the fact the enforcement agencies, as in Ontario, have no inspectors and no resources and completely overwhelmed and can't do fuck all anyways, right? So where to push, I guess that would be the thing. And Donna, I guess, looking at and hearing about how social innovation is going on across the world, it always makes you completely and utterly depressed. And you think, well, Jesus, you'll never win any kind of work improvement. So what about Jill's ideas? Maybe it's not about where work we should be pushing. We should be pushing on the idea of better benefits, better in-work benefits, better kinds of childcare, maternity leave. Is that kind of redistributive approach, is that something you think would have some traction in Australia?
I just wanted to add a question about Tunisia, because one of the things that I was curious about in relation to, so you had this sort of historical analysis of the economy, and then you had the labor reforms. But what I wasn't sure of is what, in a sense, the economy looks like now. And so after, some of the social upheavals and unrest after 2011, 2012, how does the labor, the employment regime relate to the organization of the economy, essentially? Like, what are the main industries? Where do people work? I wasn't sure from your presentation about that part of the context, so I'd be interested in hearing more. Okay, why don't we give everybody a chance to respond?
In the order of the papers?
Yes, that would be great.
Okay. So I want this, how can we utilise what I was talking about potentially good practices that we could learn from? Well, I think the first thing is simply to make them, clearer that not everything that one does in one country is replicated in another country, because I think we tend to assume that all countries exclude all self-employed from benefits, whereas I was saying we find that 3 countries of the 6 were paying maternity leave to people who are self-employed. So I think just, at least it enters the public debate if you can actually, if you like, map these different practices and point out that there are different ways of organising social protection. Now, I understand that each system has its kind of own logic and problem and issues, but some things are kind of simply bizarre in some respects. I mean, the UK has the most restrictive maternity leave rights to give them the least level of benefits. And the fact, I didn't stress that, but you have to work 6 months for for one employer before you can have right to paid maternity leave. In other countries, it's actually general employment record. So once you start having that kind of debate, why, you can start having the debate, why do we do that whereas other countries don't? So that's a soft way of pushing back. But I think we also have to recognise there is a big debate going on now about the gig economy. There is a debate about how can we regulate and improve things around the gig economy. So there is an opportunity, I think, to start talking about these things. I think the bigger problem is, the potentially perverse effects of some of these things and how we deal with them. I mean, one of the things I think is very important, it would be to focus on getting employers to be paying their fair share of social protection costs, and that means not doing individual social protection contributions, but a tax on the total that employers pay in wages and in fees to the self-employed, rather than this individualised approach, because the UK government has been priding itself on how many individuals and employers have been taken out of the tax and social security system. And if we carry on doing that, we won't have any social protection at all. So if I was going to sort of prioritise, I would say let's make certain that there isn't this huge incentive that exists in the UK to take on self-employed and low-wage workers because the employers get a tax holiday. And instead we need to reform that. And that at least, I think we compare a lot our low-wage workers to mini jobs in Germany. But in Germany, the employers have to pay 30% on the mini jobs. In the UK, you get a complete free holiday until you earn people earn £136 a month. And those are such different systems. And if you just need to at least publicise it, people can be made aware of it. And at least it can start a debate with the opposition parties and everything to feed into their political manifestos. I'm not saying that's going to solve all the problems of the world, but there are things you can do at that incremental level to make clear that we don't have to do things exactly how we do them at the moment.
I think just picking up on the point about the low pay commission in Ireland and kind of who's going to push this and where to push, and I think there are lots of individuals and organisations that are pushing on lots of different elements, but the problem is you fix one and employers find a way to circumvent another. And it's very difficult to coordinate all the different factors that combine to create these negative situations for precarious workers, because there's so many different contexts that can impact on it. It's difficult to kind of, to fix them all. So for example, yes, we have a low pay commission, and the low pay commission does, great work in increasing hourly rates of pay, but that's not even the biggest problem for a lot of these workers. The problem is unpredictability of pay, fluctuations of pay, control by employers of pay, the kind of balancing and interaction between social welfare. So the actual hourly rate is one part of the problem, and yes, there are people pushing that, and that might improve. And then governments can kind of hide behind some of these fixes, and look, isn't it great, our hourly rate is up here, neglecting to mention the fact, well, some weeks you might have 3 hours on that rate, and another week you might have none, and another week, so it's difficult to kind of say who and how to push on all the different factors. And possibly some of the reflections from the sessions we've seen today is that it has to go back to the collective. It has to go back to things like collective bargaining and protection for collective bargaining, rather than individual powerless workers trying to compete against all the different elements that are working against them and pushing back, even though we're kind of taking steps forward in some aspects of it.
Could I just make one comment? And I know but it comes back to some of in your session, is it John? Yeah. Yes. We can inform, and I don't have a huge amount of faith in the unions gaining traction in Ireland currently, but Ireland is a small open economy, and I think long term the government remain to be convinced, but I think this is something we should all be doing, that the low road for Ireland is not the way forward for the future of the Irish economy. A low cost economy rather than, you know, and Ireland, I mean, it's been recently revealed that Ireland, in a report by the Nevin Institute, Ireland, if you take out the multinationals and we're kind of wondering where they're going to go, Ireland is over-reliant currently on the retail and hospitality sectors, which are low productivity, low wage, and we're not investing enough in kind of creating more high skill, maybe high traction industries. And maybe this is where our role comes in, that we need to start convincing, we need to take a role in convincing our government of that. There's another thing, there's legislation coming down the tracks from the European Union whereby we may have to actually recognise this middle ground of worker. But I'm not sure that that's a way, I'm doing some work on it at the moment, I'm not sure that's the answer, to be honest with you, because that might actually collectively bring down the standards for more people rather than raise them. So I'm not sure that that is the answer. I think the other one is if we could achieve it, it's probably utopian, but you know, it's what we should be doing.
Yeah, so concerning the employment in Tunisia, actually since the 70s there were with the orientation to the export model of the strategy of exportation, so the country was transformed to the factory of the European Union, you know, to Europe actually. And then since the 70s there were this model which continued during the 90s, 20s, and after that 90s, and now they're talking about the deepening of the agreement with with Europe. Actually, the Union is interested to go further actually, and to cancel some boundaries between the two economies, and in the same time there is the union actually, which because since the 70s there was lots of privatization of public enterprises, and then after the 2011 the union is protecting the public sector, you know, the public enterprises. So they last week they were threatened to do a general strike, and so they got some actually more wages and more protection for this sector. So there is two tendencies in the country. Actually, the government is pushing toward more agreements with Europe, and the union is protecting the heritage of the.
And with Europe, it's still mostly textiles and leather and those kinds of products?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thanks, that's what I was curious about.
Okay, over to me. So maybe I'll start with Sally's question, which is about, there was a historic equal pay case in this sector a few years ago, where it was recognized that care work has been systemically underpaid, and that this is gender discrimination. And so since the government was and is the major funder in this sector, the government was to raise wages, and some of that has taken place, but unfortunately the Equal Pay Act didn't cover home care entirely. So it covered disability workers, and it covered a number of other community sector workers, but not home care. So what employers are doing is trying to recast everybody as a home care worker so they can get around the, and because disability workers are going into people's homes, and many of them are, new workers, and, they have a hard time saying, this is how I'm a disability worker as opposed to home care worker. It's very easy to kind of pull this off and undermine this historic case, unfortunately. And then in terms of John's question, and I'm sorry we depressed you. So I like this idea of collecting promising practices. So in another project I'm on, we don't call them best practices, but they're like promising practices. And it may be a very, very long time before Canada or Australia or the UK adopts anything like a Nordic model, but that doesn't mean we can't go to the Nordic countries where they have some really great policies on things and try to chip away or try to say, look, this is so much more logical, reasonable, effective, blah, blah, blah. So I'm a big fan of that. And then just to leave you on a hopeful note, your question on social benefits, would they have traction in Oz? Well, they did have traction in Oz for a long time. Australia had a much better social state than Canada ever had, but it also got eroded far quicker and far farther than Canada's had. which is just like one of those weird things. I don't know, my analysis is it's a polarization of political views. So there's Labour and the right wing, and there's nothing in between. And I know in Canada we're always going on and on about how we have a three-party system, but in some ways the three-party system has meant that Canada hasn't eroded as far as places like New Zealand, the UK, and Australia who had more social benefits at one point. So this is leaving you on a hopeful note, which is just this weekend there were huge marches in Australia, led by the trade union movement, and the theme of the marches was change the rules. We need to change the rules around employment, we need to change the rules around union organizing, etc. And they're the biggest rallies of working people in recent history. So I don't know why those sometimes work and sometimes they don't. Sometimes you call for a big rally and no one shows up. Sometimes you call for a big rally and everybody brings their best friend and their dog. So it is hopeful, though. We'll just go with that.
Are there any other questions or comments?
Hi, Maria Gonzalez from University of Oviedo. Really was so much information, I'm not sure I got it all. So my question, you start from identifying employment gaps, social protection gaps, representation gaps, and enforcement gaps in different countries. Okay. So my question is, the profile, who is in each of those gaps? Are they the same people? Are they the same people in different countries? And if not, can you do general recipes common to all the countries? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And for Sari, if I understood correctly, I think that you said the main union, was the main agent promoting the social pact. And could you expand a little on why was it an interest of the union to reach a social pact with employers and the government? Like in Spain, it was more in the interest of the government and the employers when they started doing social pacts to stabilize democracy and so on. So it's different. Thank you.
I might ask, sorry, I'm Chair's prerogative here, but I just have a kind of general question, which I think a number of the presentations have touched on, and I'd be interested to hear more reflections, because I think this concept of a zero-sum game could apply in different ways. I mean, what's really striking, I think, in a sense, is that in a number of cases, it's not only wages and employment rights that are being undermined, but the ability of the state to actually provide a social safety net. And that's mostly because the risk is being shifted to workers and the responsibilities of firms are declining, essentially. Firms are not responsible for anything, in essence. And so, this isn't just a question, this is partly a question of things like social insurance contributions, but it's also a question of taxation. And part of the problem with the zero-sum game that we see in the healthcare sector is that the low tax discourse is so powerful at the individual level that that's part of what legitimizes the zero-sum game between workers and service users. And companies get off scot-free, in essence. So I'd just be interested if anybody has any reflections on this dynamic and whether there are pressure points or not, or any fissures in this kind of low tax emphasis and discourse that has been so powerful under neoliberalism.
Okay, we started. I introduced the project as a whole at the beginning, right, which is mapping these protective gaps, and we did do this systematically for 4 different groups of workers, people in below full-time hours and variable hours work, people in temporary and fixed-term contracts, sorry, four groups. Certainly, full-time subcontracted workers, and then sort of bogus self-employed, etc. So we have done, and what we actually found for each of the four gaps is these do vary across countries by type of employment form and by which gaps matter most. So we were actually mapping sort of where the key issues are, but I can't summarise those all because I'm talking about 6 countries across all those different, across 4 gaps, all those different kinds of precarious work. So you would have to, I mean, it's 2 years since we wrote it, so I would have to remind myself anyway. But I was just trying to give you a flavour of where, so what happened was people were mapping these institutional arrangements that were causing these problems or ameliorating these problems. And then what I was doing, which we've done in this Work Employment Society paper, if you want to look at more detail, was to pull out what these, what was different across the different countries and what things might be promising that could be lessons to learn. But that wasn't really the main focus of the full project. That was something I did sort of after the project and pulled it out. So the first part was about the explaining where it came from, but not really giving you the details. So 300 pages you could have. But there was also a second part of the project within that on reducing precarious work through social dialogue. So the first thing was identifying what the problems are, and the second part was actually talking about any examples of where social dialogue had helped to ameliorate or not these problems in different countries. So it's quite a big project, and so that's I think that was the main point that sorry, I'm trying to remember, was it? Oh, and then the zero-sum game issues and what's happening. I mean, I just wanted to I think it's perhaps useful to tell people a little bit, I hinted out, but I didn't have time to explain this new universal credit system that's coming into the UK, which I think is one of the most worrying reforms that we've had. And at the moment, most of the focus in the press is about the problem of implementation and the fact that people moving from unemployment benefits or tax credits onto this universal credit will actually lose income, and that's the main focus. But instead of getting into that, which is an issue, it is a major issue, I just want to say a few words about the principles behind the universal credit system and why I think that is also a zero-sum game. Because what's happening is that the idea is that they would harmonise unemployment benefits and in-work benefits, because which appear to be completely irrational kind of barriers, that you've got to get a job that pays, that provides at least a guaranteed 16 hours if you're a single parent, or 30 hours if you're not, of work before you can move off unemployment benefits into in-work benefits. So the idea is to get rid of these cliff edges, as they say, and make a smooth transition. But the problem then is that the unemployed are now then will be required to take 0 hours contracts. So they can't turn down a job because it's not providing the 30 hours or the 16 hours. They have to take they will have to, it's all been railed out, so it's not really happened yet. They'll have to take that. But then the government's realised that this is going to be incredibly costly, because they're going to have to make up the difference. So if you get a 0 hours job, you've then but it's not providing you with 35 hours of work at the minimum wage. You're going to have to look for other jobs. You've either got to ask your employer to give you 35 hours, or you've got to look for other jobs to put together with the 0 hours job. And of course, if you have sort of 6 or 7 0 hours jobs, you might find that everybody wants you on the same day and nobody wants you other days, and you might lose all of them because it's incompatible. And if you can't find them, you're supposed to spend 35 hours looking for work, prove that you're sitting at a computer actually registering, looking for work. So you've either got to do the work or you've got to look for the work for the 35 hours. So they're putting the onus on individuals to work as if it's full time, while actually removing the obligations on employers to provide anything like full-time work. So I think that is where I find the key problem with this whole system, in addition to the fact that people are actually going to be impoverished by the new system. It wasn't planned that they would be impoverished. When it was planned, the benefits were going to be roughly comparable, possibly better for some people, but George Osborne just cut them dramatically. So So all the focus is on that, and everybody says, well, it's a good system, but, and I'm saying it's a bad system, and.
Just on the tax issue, just in Ireland, I mean, Ireland at the moment is in a very unstable situation. The government is being propped up by another party, they've lost, people have resigned, so they're not going to make unpopular decisions that are going to bring down the government, so personal taxation is not going to be touched. People are very unhappy with it anyway, even though they say it's that high. Some people fall out of the tax net and they're not going to touch those. And the other area, of course, that they could look at is corporation tax, and we know all about Ireland's corporation tax, and there's no way that the government currently are going to even look at corporation tax of multinationals, especially with Brexit coming down the road. So I think, yes, it is an obvious solution for our government, but it is something that they're just not going to touch. They did recently in the budget re-raise the VAT rate, the tax rate take from hospitality, and there nearly was a revolution, but you know there was, and it's interesting to see there is a public perception that the hospitality sector actually are in some way exploiting workers, and that they didn't pass on the savings that they were granted when the VAT rate for them was lowered to either their workers or to the consumer, and that stuck. But I don't think that they're going to go taxes, like a horrible word in the Irish Republic at the moment, and just things are too unstable for the government to go near it.
Yeah, so for the role of the union in the social pact, actually, after 2011, they were the main force in the country after the fall of the regime, and actually, I think they tried to preserve the national configuration. They wanted to keep the same configuration, the tripartism, the corporate arrangements with the employers and the government, and actually they won the Nobel Prize for peace after that, for preserving the country. And I think there is two main arguments or two main reasons for that, because there was that threatens like presence in the region, like to be then the Syria of the North Africa or the Libya or everything, you know. So they tried to preserve the country, and also I think they learned from another historical experiences. So they didn't want to take control of the country. They just wanted actually to dominate. So they tried to push toward more progressive social policies, but in the same time they had, I think, in my opinion, they had the occasion to be the political regime, to transform the country more with their ideals, but they tried just to push and to keep it like this and not to go further, because they were actually aware of the risks of being the number one in the country, I think.
So did I get the last word? I don't know, like it is sort of depressing to think that there's a bunch of zero-sum games out there and that we don't have much traction on much. But I always like to say that I think at this point in neoliberalism, it's a battle of ideas, and we have a lot of really smart people on our side, so we just have to we may not see the pressure points right now, but I'm sure they're out there. You know, I'm sure they're out there in terms of taxes, and, you know, at some point in time, many societies believe that they should care for each other and have solidarity. So, like, I don't know where that went, but I don't, you know, we've got bright people, we just have to keep doing the battle of ideas. We'll get there.
And on that optimistic note, we will let the students come in and sit there again. Can we join me in thanking our speakers one last time?